Hello! If you're here directly from my found footage 3 analysis, welcome back! I told you to be on the lookout for the next video. As always, I want to extend my appreciation and my thanks and love for all of the support that you guys show my videos. Thank you guys so much for coming back and commenting and, liking the video and everything. It really does truly mean the world to me. You have no idea how motivating you guys are. But without further ado, let's get into the lighting and tile survey analysis. The video begins on an async screen, which immediately gives us an idea of what we can expect. As if the thumbnail and title weren't enough of a giveaway as it is, but it's also the first appearance of async we've seen in quite a while. This appearance is also special due to the fact that this takes place not long after First Contact. First Contact took place on October 17th, 1989, and the events of Lighting and Tile Survey take place on November 14th, 1989. It's been just under a month since async first established contact with the complex, and we can see that they've been hard at work since then. Not only have they repaired the damage the threshold and the room sustained during the Loma Prieta earthquake, but they also have set up a decontamination room in between the complex and Standard. They even fixed the camera overlooking the threshold itself. One of the most important things to note here is how the researcher operating the camera comments on just how cold the threshold room is, and how they can't wait until they get some proper heating installed.
It is incredibly cold. Hopefully by the time you're watching this, I actually have a decent heating system down here. That'd be nice. Die of hypothermia.
They seem to be addressing someone directly, and whether they're talking about Dr. Julia Mesner or Ivan or some other async employee is unclear as of now, but it's a fun thing to think about, as if I didn't have a quadrillion other things I'd think about already. Upon entering the complex, we're greeted with various async employees who are actively mapping and plotting out the different sections of the area just past the threshold. I wanted to highlight just how good the mocapping is here. It's like watching the game you're playing seamlessly switch from gameplay to cutscene without even fading to black. Our camera person is then greeted by another employee who informs him on what to grab.
Hello, camera. Put your straps are in the bin right now. Make sure to get the red one, alright? Because the green one reads. Control.
Also, I like how the async researcher made sure to tell our camera person to grab a red strap because the green won't reach, which could be an indirect reference to the actual wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum, as the lower end features longer wavelengths, especially in the red section, and the wavelengths in the green section are shorter. I promise I'm normal, okay? We're treated to one of the earliest views of the complex in the series so far, and there's something so weird about seeing all of these researchers diving headfirst into analyzing and mapping this new area, and comparing that to how they treat the complex later on in the series. It wasn't long after this until they started being more careful. But what is interesting to note is their early adaptation of full PPE and decontamination rooms. And we'll talk more about this later on, otherwise I won't stop yapping. We then cut to researchers discussing proper ladder safety before the analog horror style presentation begins. We get an image of a lifted ceiling drop tile, a researcher moving the tile, them handing the tile to the researchers below, and the last image is of what was behind the tile, which appears to be standard looking for electrical and ductwork. However, upon looking in, a few things are made apparent. The foundation appears to be made of wood, and there is no insulation right above the ceiling, but there seems to be a substantial amount on the floor above them. I believe that the presence of this much insulation might imply a different environment sits directly above them. The researcher also notes the ductwork that is present here and comments on how some of it is even insulated. The researcher then turns their attention to the lighthousing fixture, and after giving it a quick once-over, we can see that there's no rust on it. As the researcher looks away, no doubt perplexed by the almost pristine setting, we hear a droning noise that then cuts away into our narrator for the rest of the episode, Dr. Julia Meisner. Picking up from mid-sentence, Dr. Meisner suggests that there is more than one floor in the complex, further stressing the fact that she uses the term floor loosely. I have a thought as to why she phrased it like that, but I'll bring it up later. She then begins to describe what they did in order to gather these materials, including trying to shut off the power to the nearby troffer. But it seems like they've run into a problem, as she describes here.
However, we were unable to isolate the power source, and the conduit remained live, despite the absence of any visible external power supply.
Not only were they unsuccessful in cutting the power, they also have no idea where the source of all this electricity is coming from, which is a terrifying implication as to what the source is. Luckily, they had a toolkit they were able to use that allowed them to isolate the conduit and extract the troffer, where they then took it back to standard for analysis. Dr. Meisner also notes that a 0.5 meter sample of conduit was also taken. Once they extracted their samples, they were able to safely secure all the exposed wiring and the conduit back into the ceiling. Dr. Meisner then goes on to describe the nature of the ceiling tile. And don't worry, we'll go over everything and what it all means and how it connects later on, but we should first get an idea of what it is we're dealing with. She first mentions that the measurements of the ceiling tile are not standard, as the tile measures in at 1.27 meters by 1.14 meters, a very House of Leaves moment from Kane. The tile itself is composed primarily of mineral fiber and has a normal composition. The texture of the tile is described as fissured with mild tegular edges. All I could think of when she said that was how Play-Doh looks when you try to split it apart, so the ceiling is now canonically made of Play-Doh. After further examination, the materials were noted to be 60% mineral wool, which, as Dr. Meisner describes for us, is fibers of amorphous silicate usually derived from basalt or slag. 20% of the tile is composed of expanded perlite, which is primarily silicon dioxide and aluminum oxide. The remaining 20% is an undefined mixture of silicate material, starch, latex polymers, and organic fibers derived from plant materials, more specifically referring to recycled cellulose. The light troffer housing unit is described as being made of galvanized steel coated with a thin layer of zinc. Interestingly, the fluorescent bulbs that are inside are non-standard in their proportions too, but they all seem to closely resemble T12 bulbs. Their measurements were recorded as being 1.2 meters with a diameter of 38.1 millimeters. The tubes themselves seem to have a phosphor coating and contain calcium halophosphate for converting ultraviolet light to visible light, a small amount of mercury vapor, which helps facilitate the UV light emission, and argon gas, an inert component used to help regulate the current and aid in powering the bulbs. These bulbs are connected via a G13 base, a standard 2-pin base with 13mm spacing for electrical connection, and the wiring that is connected to the fixture itself is PVC insulated copper, which is again another standard use product in the manufacturing of these lights. As for the light diffuser panel, it is made of polymethyl methacrylate, another standard component used in the manufacturing process. Dr. Meisner even points out that it is the same material used in their own light diffusion panels. Now, this is where it starts to get even more interesting. Dr. Meisner begins to describe the ballast itself. She mentions that it is of the electromagnetic type, and at the time of her analysis, 1989, they were beginning to get more varied in their manufacturing methods. The one they found contains a laminated steel core and copper windings designed to operate at 60 Hz. The ballast itself is pretty noisy, emitting a constant 120 Hz hum, and Dr. Meisner notes that this seems to be the case for the majority, if not all the lights in the complex that they've seen so far. But we know this to not be true, as certain areas of the complex that both researchers and our wanderers have encountered seem to have lights that sound louder than what you would typically hear in the standard areas of the complex we're more used to. I feel like the standard area of the complex is an oxymoron. I felt like that was just like a wrong sentence. That just felt wrong to me. Anyway. This prediction, as she notes, is based off of them simply listening to the lights, and she describes the reasoning behind the sound, and she mentions that it is due to magnetostriction and core vibration, with the noise itself possibly being exacerbated by loose lamination plates or degradation of insulating materials over time. The major thing she notes is that this suggests that the lights have been running for a bit, and that despite its age, the ballast is still somehow functional. She also notes how it seems like the large proportions suggest it was built for a non-standard space, nothing like what you'd find in a majority of office buildings or most commercial spaces. And while she admits that she's not too familiar with the subject, it is something to at least keep in mind. In her summary, she notes that while the material compositions are standard and to be expected of course being a very generous term to use, everything else seems to match up with what you'd expect from one of the troffer lights you could pull from the ceiling in async itself. But this only makes things weirder. Dr. Meisner explains that several labels were marked on various components of the troffer. The ballast is marked as a universal ballast, Type A, manufactured in 1975, with a serial number of A75-23-4X. The troffer is marked as 3X-43-2 and was manufactured in 1973 in Reading, Pennsylvania. She also notes that both the troffer and the ballast are UL listed. The bulbs themselves were manufactured in the US by Sylvania and marked F40SW, which is soft white lighting, but there's no manufacturing date. Those labels are left blank, oddly enough. She concludes that the fixture, while outdated in design and components, appears fully functional. This seems to extend to the stable operation of all the light fixtures within the subdivision, and points to a continuous, potentially autonomous power source which still remains unknown. However, given their age and stability, she concludes that they only have minimal wear, which suggests that they were built for long-term, possibly indefinite use. As she finishes her report, her voice begins to fade out as we slowly zoom into the troffer label, leaving us with the serial number and manufacturing date and location. This is one of the shorter Backrooms episodes, but as you're about to see, I was still able to make quite a few connections. So let's address the elephant in the room, the threshold. This episode, like I mentioned earlier, takes place just a month after the events of First Contact. In First Contact, we see Async running their 6th test after adding 13 more radio frequency cavities. We see that they added something else as well, but it's redacted. This, coupled with the solar activity that was occurring at that time, allowed Async to generate and rip open a null zone that was able to be sustained by the low proximity magnetic distortion system. Of course, the backlash from this much energy being generated and manipulated seems to have caused the Loma Prieta earthquake, which caused subsequent damage to the threshold area and the doorway, as we see in First Contact. But just a month later in Lighting and Tile Survey, they seem to have fixed and reinforced the threshold while also adding a decontamination chamber between the complex and standard. I want to again point out that the researcher brought up just how cold the threshold area is. This could be for a few reasons. It could be because this area of Async seems to be built underground, and given that it's November at the time of this video, it would be colder than normal. But given the fact that they're in California, I don't really think that it would get that cold to where the researcher would be joking about hypothermia. Unless you're in San Francisco, where it gets super foggy and chilly, but again, not nearly as cold enough for hypothermia. At least I don't think. So this is more than likely not the reason. But my main two thoughts are that it's very cold in that area because for fusion to work, you need to ensure the materials don't overheat, so you use super cold materials in order to maintain temperature, or the complex itself is very cold, and that cold is seeping into standard, which is a terrifying aspect of the complex. It's one thing to be trapped in an endless labyrinth of hallways and rooms with no end in sight, but can you imagine being really, really cold while doing it? Once again, major House of Leaves vibes here. The way the researchers are approaching the complex in this time period compared to just a few months later is interesting. They still have that somewhat casual demeanor and calm composure, but it's during this time that they still have no idea what to be afraid of or what to even expect. They're not aware of the life forms or still life, or the temporal or spatial anomalies, or the Hay bacillus bacteria for that matter. As far as they know, it's just a massive storage room that appeared out of nowhere. We also don't hear any mention of Ivan in this episode, unless our researcher holding the camera was indirectly talking to him when he mentioned having heating installed, but I don't know. We do see an initial shot of the camera that overlooks the threshold, but nothing else that references him. What we do get more info on is something that I believe the community has been waiting for a while now, and that's about the complex itself. This video gives us a look into the inner workings of the complex and helps us scratch that itch of wondering what exactly sits just above the researchers while they're on their expeditions, as well as give us some more answers on the physical aspects of the complex. And we have a lot to go over, so let's start at the very beginning. Here, we can see the connection Async and the Department of Energy have this early on after First Contact. From my video on Ivan's connection to the complex, I talked about Ivan's past and speculated on just how long he's been involved with the government and, even more specifically, the Department of Energy. I theorized that when Ivan immigrated to the US, his reasoning was more than likely either to find a new job in post-World War II America, or him and his family immigrated after escaping the impending German regime and takeover that was impacting their home country of Czechoslovakia, now known as the Czech Republic. So, going off of that speculation, we've already established that Ivan was more than likely researching and working on alternative forms of energy, specifically to try and achieve fusion. However, we don't know exactly where Ivan worked at up until Oak Ridge National Laboratory from Prototype, which took place in 1982, wherein I speculated that he was presenting a prototype of the low proximity magnetic distortion system to the Department of Energy and or the director of Async. Though we theorized that the events of overflow, which occurred in 1972, about 10 years prior to Prototype, was the point in which everything had changed for Ivan. And this would have more than likely taken place in Illinois, as implied implied by the track Midwestern Trauma Light from the Out of Sync playlist, and other various hints I talked about before. If you don't remember what happened during overflow, it's implied that an experiment Ivan was conducting went wrong and caused an accident, hurting him in the process and somehow establishing a link to the complex. Given that the events of overflow would most likely be the reason the complex exists in the first place, it makes sense for the manufacturing labels of the Ballasts and the Troffers to be close in date. Of course, we know time works weirdly in the complex, so perhaps the years indicate when that section of the complex came into existence? The complex seems to be continuously expanding and creating new areas. Maybe areas that are created later on in the timeline will also have components in manufacturing that is reflective of that time period. But then, why would the Ballasts and the Troffer have different manufacturing years, and why would the Ballast be older than the Troffer itself? Let's talk about the Troffer really quick. Aside from having a standard composition of galvanized steel, which is just steel with a protective coating of zinc on its surface, it has a label that notes it was manufacturing in Reading, Pennsylvania. And yes, it's Reading. I thought it was Reading too, but I promise you it's Reading. Okay, don't yell at me. Reading is a city in Pennsylvania that is known for being a manufacturing powerhouse in the mid-19th century. In fact, one of the biggest reasons Reading is famous is due to the Reading Railroad, which was once the largest corporation in the world. The railroad itself was also among the first railroads ever built in the country, and has been immortalized in Monopoly due to the company's very, interesting history. But the reason I bring them up is because on the board from Overflow, you can see what looks like a map on the board as the camera zooms in. This is actually a map detailing routes and lines for railroads. I'm still not entirely sure how this all connects, unless Ivan at one point lived in Reading, Pennsylvania, or worked there, but the video really focuses on that Troffer label as Dr. Meisner's voice fades out. So I guess we'll have to wait and see what comes out of the Pennsylvania connection. As for the ballast, you'd think that the ballast would be something that is more likely to break down and need replacing, but from what Dr. Meisner said, there only seems to be minimal wear despite these lights running almost constantly for the past 16 to 17 years. Now, usually that's not a problem because your standard ballast is built to last for about 20 years, but Dr. Meisner mentions that this is an electromagnetic ballast, and those only last about 10 to 15 years, and that's with standard usage. Remember, these lights are implied to have been constantly running and will continue to run as it seems like they were built for indefinite use. So 10 to 15 years is a very generous amount of time for these types of ballasts at that kind of usage. Speaking of their usage, while they may only have minimal wear, they all emit a loud buzz at 120 Hz. We also see evidence of things like flickering lights as well.
Hey.
Both of these are signs of failure in the ballast and a sign that it needs to be replaced. With that, we've established that while the lights seem to have minimal wear despite their constant usage, they're still showing signs of failure. Keep that in mind. As for the bulbs, we know that it was manufactured by Sylvania, a real company by the way, but we don't know when it was manufactured as the labels for the month and the year were both left blank. We also know that it is more likely a T12 fluorescent light bulb. This is important to note because there are T5 and T8 tube bulbs which are newer and much more efficient at producing light due to the fact that they create light through electronic-based circuitry rather than electromagnetic induction, which is a much less efficient way of producing light and is the way the T12 models operate. Another way to tell the difference between the three iterations is by the diameter of the lamp. T5 lamps are 5/8 of an inch in diameter, T8s are 1 inch in diameter, and T12 are 1.5 inches in diameter. Dr. Meisner notes that the diameter of the bulb itself is 38.1 millimeters, which, when converted to freedom units, comes in at around 1.5 inches, matching the measurements for a standard T12 bulb. But while they match the diameter for a T12 bulb, they're still described as being non-standard in proportion. The label we see marked F40 SW actually does mean something. Of course, the SW, as Dr. Meisner mentioned, stands for soft white in lighting, but the interesting thing about this, I couldn't find any bulb types that actually use soft white. It's always cool white. Soft white has a yellower tint to the light, while cool light has a more white or blue cast. As for the F40, the F refers to the lamp itself being fluorescent, and the 40 refers to the wattage of the bulb. So these bulbs are all 40-watt bulbs. Unfortunately, there's not much more that can be extrapolated from the outside of the bulb itself, especially since the manufacturing date was left blank. But Sylvania as a company has an interesting history. See, they were a company that developed electronics and other consumer products, including, but not limited to, household light bulbs, radios, and even vacuum tubes. Formerly known as the high-grade Sylvania Corporation, this company began preliminary research on fluorescent lighting technology in 1931. Interestingly enough, this is also the year that Ivan was born. They would then demonstrate the first linear, or tubular, fluorescent lamp at the 1939 New York World's Fair. In 1942, the company would then rebrand as Sylvania Electric Products Incorporated, as they were also developing vacuum tubes and transistors. This work got them noticed by the government during World War II, which allowed them to get chosen among several competing companies to manufacture the miniature vacuum tubes used in proximity fuse shells due to their quality standards and mass production capabilities. This success wouldn't last long, however, as they went defunct in 1959, more than likely due to the fallout of an accident that happened in 1956 at one of their facilities in the Bayside of Queens in New York City, where 9 people were left injured and 1 perished from his injuries due to an explosion involving scrap thorium, a radioactive metal. They would then end up merging with General Telephone in 1959 and form General Telephone and Electronics, though they were still able to manufacture products using the Sylvania label. One interesting thing to note is that in June of 1964, Sylvania unveiled a color TV picture tube in which euphorium-bearing phosphor was used for a much brighter and truer red than was ever possible before. Interesting when you remember the number of references to the color red and televisions both throughout the series and the Out of Sync tracks. They would then go on to continue manufacturing and selling their products, eventually becoming a significant but never dominating supplier of electrical distribution equipment. They would supply transformers, switch gears, residential and commercial load centers and breakers, push buttons, and much more. This, of course, includes lighting. That's pretty much where the relevant and interesting parts of this connection end, but we're still not done with the bulbs because now we get to talk about what is inside of those bulbs. With typical electric lighting and circuitry, it's a very standard method that relies on electronics rather than what electromagnetic ballasts do, and that is known as electromagnetic induction. Electromagnetic induction is the production of an electromotive force, similar to currents, across an electrical conductor in a changing magnetic field. This process reacts with the gases both inside the bulb and in the inner surface coating of the bulb itself to create light. While effective for long periods of time, they are unfortunately less efficient than the electric ballast. So, when companies began manufacturing these lights with electrical ballast instead of electromagnetic ballast, they also had to change the bulb type, as the T12 bulbs are meant for electromagnetic induction rather than electrical conduction. The gases that were inside the bulbs were listed as a small amount of mercury vapor to facilitate the UV light emission and argon gas, an inert compound used to help regulate the current and aid in powering the bulbs. There was also a phosphor and calcium halophosphate coating on the inner surface of these bulbs for converting ultraviolet light to visible light. Now, this is something I was really excited to talk about when it came up in the video. Ultraviolet light. The lights use an electromagnetic ballast. If you have no idea why I'm so excited about this, it's because I theorize that the lights themselves have something to do with the temporal anomalies within the complex. Let's talk about Peter's time skip really quick.
Hey.
We saw blue when Peter moved forward in time, and from the moment that I saw this in an informational video, I knew it had to be intentionally put in there because, well, it's Kane. He said he tries to ensure everything he adds has a reason for being there. It's because of that sentiment that I tried to look for any other examples of this, but it really seems like this is the only usage of this blue that isn't from a blue message screen. This entire effect of Peter jumping forward in time is really cool, and I figured it had to be a visual representation of a natural phenomenon. So I was doing research on ultraviolet radiation, and I learned some interesting stuff. One of the major things to note about UV radiation is that it comes directly after the visible light spectrum. We've already established that the green light we see is a representation of the visible light spectrum, but we still haven't learned about what comes after. We didn't even know whether anything would come after the green light, yet we've only seen it show in very sparse and specific situations, either as the visual effect that accompanies the time skip or as a blue message screen. Regarding the visual effect, it's important to note that many natural phenomena have visual indicators. The generation or expansion of a null zone can be showcased by the green light, but not always. But when it comes to UV radiation, it's invisible to humans and not even cameras can pick it up. So Why is there such a prominent visual effect here? I believe this is due to a phenomenon known as Cherenkov radiation. This is electromagnetic radiation that is emitted when a charged particle passes through a dielectric medium at a speed greater than the phase velocity of light in that medium. This is similar in nature to a sonic boom, where a loud boom is heard when an object moves faster than the speed of sound. A common example of this type of electromagnetic radiation is the blue glow that underwater nuclear reactors have, like this image of Cherenkov radiation in the core of the Advanced Test Reactor located in the Idaho National Laboratory. Do you see where I'm going with this? I believe this is another solid lead on the connection the lights have with the temporal anomalies within the complex. I believe Peter's time skip was an example of Cherenkov radiation. Peter and the camera in this case would be the charged particle, as he entered an area that seemed to be some sort of unstable null zone, which allowed him to pass through space-time faster than the speed of light, which could be one of the reasons why the lights went out and came back on during the skip. It's like being captured around a black hole and experiencing the time dilation that goes with it. Remember, in damage control, it was clarified that to Peter, it only felt like he had been gone for a few hours, and his body and his health reflected that too. But he had indeed been gone for 2 months. As of now, we don't know if this effect can happen independently of the lights supposedly malfunctioning, or if it does require some sort of instability in the light mechanism or the power. We also don't know if this effect is congruent with the presence of null zones in every instance, or if it even requires a null zone for it to happen at all. But what we do know, for now, at least deals with the gases used inside the lamp, so let's get into those. Starting with the mercury vapor, this gas is contained within the tube and is excited by an electric current, emitting ultraviolet radiation that then causes the phosphor and calcium halophosphate coating on the inner surface of the bulb to glow, producing visible light. The argon gas within the tube is used as the primary filler gas. This acts as an inert medium that allows for the electrical current to pass through the tube while protecting the internal components from corrosion. It's used because argon doesn't react with the other components used in the light production process, including the mercury vapor, which is where the preventative factor in component corrosion comes in. Moving on to calcium halophosphate. This is a material used in fluorescent lamp coatings, which helps to nearly double the lifespan of the lamp. However, by modern standards, the halophosphate materials aren't as efficient and provide lower quality lighting compared to newer technologies. They also tend to require more electricity to produce light in the first place. It's for these reasons that they were eventually phased out of usage in favor for electronic ballasts. Again, like Dr. Meisner mentioned, these are all standard components and compositions of the lights themselves. The only non-standard thing about the bulbs, the ballast, and the troffer is that, despite their age, they only have minimal wear, not to mention their proportions are non-standard. It's the perfect way to showcase what it means for something to be uncanny. It looks the same and functions the same, but there are things about their appearance and function that make it weird to think about. Why do the lights buzz and flicker if there's only minimal wear to the lighting components? How are the troffer and lighting components so clean and free of dust? There wasn't even dust floating around in that ceiling area when we got a peek up there. How are these lights manufactured for constant indefinite usage with only minimal issues, especially since they're almost 20 years old? This probably ties into my theory of Ivan having some part of him projected as a 0 point for the complex. If that part of Ivan is the 0 point, then I feel like it would make sense for him to be able to endlessly power the complex despite the age of the components themselves, because for him, time would be more than likely non-existent or extremely slow, or maybe even passing the same. While the area extending outwards from Ivan would be experiencing the continuation of normal time as well as the time dilation events. But again, this is all speculation until we get more answers from Kane, so let's talk about the tiles. The tile is immediately flagged as being non-standard in proportion, measuring in at 1.27 meters by 1.14 meters, and converted to freedom units, that measures in at about 50 inches by 44 inches. The surface of the tile is described by Dr. Meisner as being fissured, with mild tegular edges, and has a material composition mix of 60% mineral wool, which, as Dr. Meisner described, is fibers of amorphous silicate usually derived from basalt or slag. I wanted to find out what the more likely material this wool would be derived from, so I looked up basalt and slag and figured that from my prior speculation that Ivan is interested in helping the environment. Keeping this in mind, and after comparing the two, I want to say that it's more likely made of slag, as slag has many practical uses in both manufacturing and in helping the environment, including construction, upcycling, environmental remediation, and even being used as fertilizer. Basalt, on the other hand, is mainly used for insulation and for building materials. 20% of the tile is expanded perlite, which is primarily silicon dioxide and aluminum oxide. The remaining 20% is an undefined mixture of silicate material, starch, latex polymers, and organic fibers derived from plant materials, more specifically referring to recycled cellulose. Again, this is all standard material used for the tiles themselves. The only thing off about the tile is the fact that its proportions are non-standard. They're also theorized to be a possible reason the humming of the lights is so loud, but I personally don't believe this. The main thing about the tiles, however, that do intrigue me is the fact that they were hiding this entire section that you'd primarily see used for things like ductwork, lighting, and wiring, among other things. But there's no insulation anywhere except for the floor directly above them. And as I was looking at this insulation and I was looking at a picture of mineral wool, it looks like they used the same material. So that means that the insulation for the floor above this floor, the floor that our researchers are currently on, is made of the same material that the tiles of that floor are made of. So does it go from there? Is this insulation like yeast, like mother yeast for making bread? I don't know. This is really weird. This is such a weird development, but I don't know. What do you guys think? Dr. Meisner mentions that she believes there is more than one floor to the complex, and I want to highlight again that she uses the term floor very loosely, as we've seen wanderers go upstairs and get to areas that should be a higher or lower floor, but it's still the same floor, or rather the same section. It's honestly hard to tell due to the fact that most of the areas of the complex pretty much just look the same. Marvin fell down a hole into a lower section of the complex, but the area he fell into looks virtually the same. The only difference being the red neighborhood to his left, obviously. We also saw from found footage too how Madison looks at the tiles on the floor and then up to the impossibly tall ceiling, where we see the gaping void of what I assume is a similar looking area to where the async researchers were peeking into. There were multiple floors that we can immediately notice in that scene as well, so maybe this implies that this particular section of the complex has multiple floors and the next actual floor is a different portion of the complex that we haven't even seen yet. This makes me wonder if this is what got Async really intrigued with the concept of vertical expansion. Another example would be the Red City, where we see Ravi taking the skywalk back upwards only to end up a single floor higher than he was, and of course back at the beginning. But we already talked about how tragic that was. But that was it for the lighting and tile survey analysis. We didn't learn much, but what we did learn seemed to point us towards a lot of leads in our speculation. A lot of what I talked about seems to be giving us more info on the background of the complex, but without much more to go off of, all we can do is wait for the next video to come out and go from there. I really hope you guys enjoyed this two-parter, and if you did, be sure to leave a like. Maybe you noticed something that I didn't, or have a different perspective on something I overlooked. You know, whatever it is, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope y'all take care, and I will see y'all in the next one.